In 1889, when the hundreds of Armagh Sunday school students, staff and family members climbed aboard the Great Northern Railway passenger train bound for their day trip to a seaside religious retreat in Warren Point, little did they know before the train would even get halfway there, the day trip would turn into a nightmare of operator errors, locked exit doors, and poor judgment by management with horrific consequences. It was planned to be a fun summer Wednesday for the Armagh Methodist Church Sunday School Group, and the Great Northern Railway of Ireland, or GNR, prepared an entire train dedicated exclusively to the occasion, known as an excursion train, to pick them up at Armagh Station. Planned to leave out by 10 a.m., the trip would be roughly 40 kilometers to Warren Point, a relatively simple 1 to 2 hour train ride each way. The railway put together a train 15 cars long, 13 of which dedicated to passengers, as the expected number of attendees was over 900. It's been said the Warren Point seaside location was a destination for all religious denominations, and the trip attracted many others simply for the chance to get a cheap ticket to the resort. The remaining 2 vehicles being brake vans, train cars that are heavier, and either a combination of third-class passenger vehicle and guard compartment, as is known in the industry, where a crewman operates the brake handle, or a separate car on its own used specifically to aid only in stopping power, each being manned by 1 crewman. 1 combination brake third carriage would be at the rear, and a dedicated brake van toward the front, just behind the engine and coal tender car. A heavy fog prevailed that day as the train left the station by 10:15 a.m., running late by 15 minutes. As they departed Armagh Station, it was slightly chaotic with so many excited children on board, and the fact the cars were so crowded. Many passengers were even allowed into the front brake van and guard compartment of the rear brake carriage, a practice railways of the time frowned upon, but hadn't started enforcing by this point, nor did they lock the door securely between the passenger cars and brake compartments. Just beyond the outskirts of Armagh, though, the train began decelerating steadily, having never picked up a great deal of speed to begin with, and for the next mile and a half, on the long uphill gradient out of town, it would never get back up to speed. In fact, at roughly 2 miles outside of town now, slowly and finally nearing the top of the long, uphill climb, the entire train would come to a complete stop. The light-duty locomotive, even with a full head of steam, still unable to accelerate any further. Just 500 feet or less from the hill's crest, the train had stalled. While the train sat, with brakes applied and staying safely in place, Mr. Elliot, the station master's chief clerk and ranking company officer, riding along in the engine with the driver and fire tender, hastily let the driver know that they should divide the train at the 5th and 6th cars in order to get the front portion over the hill, with the intention of pulling the 5 cars off to the siding at Hamilton's Bond Station, roughly 4 miles down the line. Then, come back with the locomotive for the remaining 9 passenger carriages and rear brake third carriage. The driver, Thomas McGrath, who was new to this route, would defer to Mr. Elliot's judgment. Mr. Elliot, walking alongside, approached the rear of the train to speak with Thomas Henry, the rear brake carriage crewman, instructing him quickly to apply his brake and scotch the wheels with stones. Scotching the wheels being placing an object between the wheel and the track to further prevent them from rolling, in this instance, improvising though with stones found outside, not ideal as they can be more easily overcome than proper wheel scotches. Henry had applied the brake though, as was typical procedure when coming to a stop. Mr. Elliot then made his way back within earshot of William Moorhead, the front brake van's crewman, waved him down to join him at about the 5th car and instructed him to uncouple the train just in front of the 6th car. Mr. Moorhead uncoupled the 2 cars and the train remained firmly in place. After doing so, Mr. Elliot told him to go ahead to the station at Hamilton's Bond and hurry back with the engine. Mr. Moorhead let the driver know this, jumped back into his brake van, and upon releasing the brake, felt the van move back roughly a foot or so. Mr. Henry, outside the train, had scotched the wheels of the rear brake van and was putting down a few extra under the wheels of the next car when he felt it rolling back as well. Jumping back into the now rolling rear brake carriage, and with the help of some passengers, They tried as best they could to get another turn of the brake handle, to no avail. Mr. Elliot ran to catch it, jumped up alongside yelling at them to apply more, but the handbrake was already applied as much as possible. Screaming, "Oh my God, we will all be killed," Mr. Elliot jumped off at a reported 20 miles per hour, tumbling in the grass alongside. Mr. Moorhead jumped from the front brake van to give chase on foot, hoping to recouple the two cars before it was too late. He unfortunately tripped and tumbled twice though, and did not reach the runaway portion, now accelerating back toward Armagh. The slight rollback, or slack, of the train, when the driver took the brakes off preparing to move forward, was just enough to bump the 10 separate cars back, such that they came free and began to roll, steadily increasing their distance from the front section. The driver, Mr. McGrath, would reverse the engine in an attempt to, maybe, catch up with the 10 runaway vehicles, but this effort was in vain. The loose portion was accelerating now, down the long grade much too quickly. Mr. Henry in the rear brake van would watch as the speed increased to the point where everything out the windows started to go by so quickly that even the hedges could not be seen as they were passed. The heavily loaded 10 cars had been gathering speed now for over a mile, down the steep grade. Back at Armagh Station, roughly 20 minutes prior, the regularly scheduled 10:35 a.m. Armagh Newry passenger train had departed. A train consisting of one horse boxcar, a front brake van, 3 passenger carriages, and a rear brake van. This train, pulling much less load than the excursion train, had reached 20 to 30 miles per hour before it had even fully left town. Mr. Hurd, the train's fire tender, caught a glimpse of something ahead coming toward them on the tracks. Being on the right side of the driver's box meant the slight curve in the track ahead, luckily, afforded him a view of the oncoming runaway cars. Mr. Hurd immediately called out loudly, "Hold!" Mr. Murphy, the train's driver, blasted the whistle, shut off steam, and applied the brakes with full force. Hurd also leapt into action, reversing the steam, and both brake van crewmen also immediately applied their handbrakes. The 10:35 train had slowed now to roughly 5 miles per hour. With all reverse and brakes fully applied, Mr. Hurd jumped off the locomotive to the right, tumbling down the steep grass embankment, as Murphy remained on board the engine, bracing himself as best he could in those final moments. The collision was catastrophic. The first 3 cars of the runaway excursion train completely disintegrated against the engine of the 10:35 train, their flimsy wooden parts and even wheel assemblies effectively exploding down the sides of each embankment. The runaway train finally came to a stop, with the now 4th rear vehicle narrowly avoiding destruction. Murphy, the 10:35 engine's driver, still clinging to it, said after the initial instant dead stop, the engine shook, the cars separated from it, and it slumped over to the right of the tracks. Its heavy weight presumably brought it to rest on its side, just avoiding tumbling further down. The engine had somehow separated from its tinderbox, and the tinderbox and horse car began rolling together with the rest of the 10:35 train, also rolling separately back down the incline. The driver, Murphy, came to and gave chase on foot, using the tender car's handbrake to stop it and the horse box. The rear brake van crewman, Mr. Graham, having been knocked off his feet in the impact, quickly came to, realizing the brake released again somehow in the impact and that they were rolling backwards. He was able to stop his remaining portion promptly as well. Both portions only going about a quarter mile and reaching speeds of roughly 5 miles per hour, the actions of Mr. Murphy and Mr. Graham averting further disaster, with Armagh Station easily within rolling distance behind. The scene at the collision site, though, was horrifying. In all, a reported 400 were injured, and of the 89 souls lost, 46 were children. All crew members had survived from both trains, and miraculously, even Mr. Henry in the rearmost passenger brake compartment, albeit a separate compartment that has substantially more iron in its construction than the flimsy passenger carriages. Initial fact-finding, investigations, and subsequent employee interviews would be performed by the UK Board of Trade's Railway Department. With their initial report published just short of 1 month later, on July 8th of 1889. The findings, which would lead to sweeping industry-wide safety reform throughout UK railways, painted a picture of such gross negligence by so many that should there have been a lack of sweeping reform in the face of such a shocking, tremendous loss, it can't be understated how abhorrent inaction would have been. And for their parts, those crew interviewed, even those who would be found at direct fault, were very forthcoming. At Dundalk Station's locomotive department, where Great Northern Railway housed and dispatched this area's locomotives, the railway company received the excursion train request. A request to accommodate a party of 800 passengers, mostly children, and 13 vehicles, the planned weight being approximately 157 tons when loaded. The primary locomotive foreman and superintendents being absent, the plans made in their stead by a Mr. William Fenton. The locomotive chosen, number 86, a light-duty steam engine that was considered just enough for the originally planned 13 cars. Thomas McGrath, the soon-to-be driver of the excursion train, was new to driving the route, the engine, and excursion trains altogether. He had acted only as fire tender prior to this point and took notice of the lackluster engine situation, but was reluctant to outright object to this engine's assignment. At Armagh Station, when it was clear the train would be increased from 13 to 15 vehicles total, along with many more passengers than originally planned, McGrath attempted to object, but Armagh station manager barked back at McGrath, stating, "Any driver that comes here does not grumble about taking an excursion train with him." McGrath's sense of confidence was renewed once again. However, the Board of Trade did still hold McGrath partly responsible, which we'll circle back around to shortly. It was found that both brake vehicles should have been placed at the rear, both to aid in braking for such situations, a known possibility on a route with well-known steep gradients like the Armagh Newry line, but to also ensure passengers can't interfere with braking operations of at least the rearmost van. In the instance of the accident train, though, passengers were in and amongst both brake compartments the entire time. However, and perhaps the most horrifying of circumstances during the runaway, though, was that very few, with a great chance of near zero passengers, would have been able to bail out, as all carriage doors had been locked on both sides from the outside. Even at the time, a very controversial practice, as it had led to similar situations in the past. Stubborn station and train managers, though, by the time of this disaster, were still insistent on its practice, being customary at the time with excursion trains, especially those with children, to prevent them from opening doors while the train was in motion, and, supposedly, to prevent unauthorized passengers from entering the more chaotic excursion trains. Direct and primary blame, though, fell to the lack of manual braking power, as stated at the rear, more importantly, combined with the lack of a continuous vacuum automatic braking system. At the time, train braking systems were still evolving. The simple vacuum braking system had been widely adopted and was more powerful than its steam-powered predecessor, but it was not automatic in the event of cars dividing, hoses uncoupling, and so on. Brakes on each car would end up releasing at the loss of pressure. In the continuous automatic system, to oversimplify, the hoses running the length of the entire train in each car's independent braking system maintained a vacuum or zero atmospheric pressure. In other words, the brakes were released while this lack of pressure, or basically zero air inside the lines, was maintained. The driver could apply brake pressure through controls that allowed air back into the system. So, the amount of air rushing back into the system dictated the amount of brake pressure. Now, more importantly, if a dividing of cars, an accident, or any other damage occurs that allows air to rush back into the system, and especially if it returns to atmospheric pressure levels, the vacuum continuous brakes are automatically forced back into the maximum braking position and remain there indefinitely, effectively making every vehicle immovable without the intervention of vacuum introduced back into the brake lines. The Armagh excursion train was only equipped with a simple vacuum system, one of many passenger trains of the time period that railway companies throughout the UK didn't feel necessary to upgrade, and the braking force of the manual, hand crank systems of each brake van are dependent on the amount of turns in the crank. Most causal, though, was the rushed, poor decision-making by Mr. Elliot. In the time period, it wasn't uncommon to get assistance from oncoming trains on the same line, knowing full well the 10:35 a.m. train would be en route, The decision to immediately send a signalman to run back to the minimum 1,200 yards, or 1,100 meters, and flag down the following train would mean with minimal hassle they could have allowed the assistance of the 1035 to push them, at the very least, to Hamilton's Bond Station, both trains losing little time in the process, and the 1035 even staying relatively on schedule. Mr. Elliott's plan, however, to hastily divide the train, aside from the obvious ramifications of this tragedy, meant at least an extra 20 minutes blocking the Armagh-Newry line, going back and forth to Hamilton's Bond, with the divided portions had the plan even worked. More importantly, according to their own company's rulebook, regardless of the reasons, Rule number 223, when a train is stopped from any cause, the guard, brake van crewman turned signalman, must immediately go back 1,200 yards to stop any following train. The guard must not return until recalled by the engine's driver sounding the whistle. Mr. Elliott was also ultimately responsible to ensure the rear brake van was in a proper state to hold the train securely prior to separation, separating cars along train lines when not at a station being somewhat of a big deal. And he was to ensure the train holds position until the brake van crewman has confirmed he's on board and ready. In this instance, Mr. Elliott, instead of verifying Mr. Henry's brake status, ordered him quickly out of the compartment to scotch wheels, then giving the order to Mr. Moorhead to divide the train and have McGrath get underway to Hamilton's Bond, while Mr. Henry was still outside his brake compartment. Mr. Elliott, also outranking the driver Thomas McGrath, prior to even getting underway from Armagh Station, should have insisted in overriding anyone's decision to attempt the incline with this engine without assistance. McGrath's lacking knowledge of steam engine management, as driver, was found indirectly to blame. Despite the engine lacking in power, even McGrath himself used a previous example of the same number 86 engine carrying out a similar task he witnessed in the past, up the same gradient with 15 cars and nearly the same weight, as part of his reasoning and confidence to continue with this particular engine alone. The Board of Trade confirmed this experimental run McGrath referred to in the past did legitimately take place, and that the same engine pulled all 15 cars as high as 15 miles per hour over the summit. The difference? The run in question took place with a much more experienced driver at the controls. In his interview, Mr. Henry's personal recounting of his application of the brakes at the rear van before exiting to scotch wheels with rocks also remained in question. This tragedy at the time, Europe's worst ever railway accident, brought about a plethora of sweeping, meaningful, immediate change to UK railway practices that can be seen even today. The Regulation of Railways Act of 1889, essentially dethroning each private railway company over their own safety procedures and establishing direct state intervention and proper authority over such matters, was enacted within just 2 months as a direct result of the Armagh disaster. The block telegraph system, a system of both automated and manually operated signals along every rail line, connected via telegraph wires, would revolutionize the signaling of blocks or sections of track, indicating when each section is either accessible or occupied by a current train, providing enough time and distance for any oncoming train to slow or completely stop until the section ahead is clear, along with interlocks of these systems to prevent signal conflicts. The continuous vacuum automatic brake system, after investigations, was found to be equipped on only 6 individual vehicles in all of Ireland. It would now be mandatory for the UK as a whole. Many of these private railway companies, of course, did try and push back, pleading as to why they should still self-regulate, but these accidents, for similar reasons to the Armagh disaster, had been adding up, and the loss of life to such egregious, unpredictable decision-making and lack of standardization between vehicles, lines, and systems could no longer be ignored. The subsequent trial, or inquest, also commenced rather quickly as well. A reported 6 railway employees went under investigation between the planners at Dundalk and accident train crew, 3 of which ending up charged with manslaughter, Mr. Elliott and 2 others. The cases, however, ended up dropped, with Mr. Elliott acquitted and the other 2 dismissed thereafter. Mr. Murphy, Mr. Hurd, and the crew of the 10:35 a.m. train applauded as heroes in their quick actions preventing further disaster, taking action even after being rocked by the impact. A very poignant memorial was unveiled in 2014 in the city center of Armagh. Helping to make this channel possible are the Immortar supporters, and special thanks go out to top-tier Patreon supporters, Kat and Jenny. Thanks for watching, everyone, and take care.